Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Desnede, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to begin today by stating it is an honor to speak to Bill C-8, an act to amend the Citizenship Act. The oath of citizenship sworn by all new citizens of our great country is relatively short, compact, and simple. But at the same time, it is a profound promise to faithfully observe all the laws of Canada. It is an affirmation of patriotism and loyalty. As we consider Bill C-8 today, the bill itself is quite easy to support in principle. As my colleague from Kildone and St. Paul said earlier, our party was pleased to support this bill on second reading. It is one of the 94 recommended actions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Prime Minister Harper initiated. In fact, it was under Prime Minister Harper's leadership in this area that we have directly been responsible for us having the opportunity to discuss Bill C-8 today and the potential implementation of that bill. When discussing the merits of this bill, it would be easy to digress and get caught up in some of the finer details. For example, that the wording in the oath proposed is slightly different than that suggested by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That this change in oath could be considered redundant, as new citizens are already required to swear or affirm that they will observe all of the laws of Canada, which includes Aboriginal rights enshrined already in our Constitution. As well, that people don't become a Canadian citizen overnight. The ceremonial event of declaring an oath includes the accumulation of years of required residency, learning one or both of Canada's official languages, and studying the many documents and data contained in the Discover Canada Handbook that contains a detailed look at the history of Indigenous people that are essential learnings before the citizenship test. However, instead of focusing on these details, I would like to speak for a few minutes about some of the more important issues on the ground during these tumultuous times. This government has expressed in words many times in the last few weeks that it does not have time to deal with trivial matters such as ethics, studying their response, and learning from the first wave of COVID-19, or even tabling a budget, because their sole focus has to be on helping people through the pandemic. This government, however, has expressed in its actions in the last few weeks their priorities by tabling bills that have no link with the pandemic. What we do hear from the Prime Minister is a self-righteous indignation, as if it was his party as the only one who cares about Indigenous people in Canada. This leads me to speak for a few moments about the frustration of the timing of this bill. At a time where Indigenous leaders are asking for actions, we are asked to sit in this House or attend virtually and debate a bill that will not resolve anything for Indigenous people in Canada in the short term. Mr. Speaker, if it is frustrating to me, imagine the signal that it sends to the actual Indigenous people and their leaders. Since being elected a year ago, I have had the privilege of working closely with Chief Ronald Mitswing from Makwasagaik First Nation. I don't know if you remember, Madam Speaker, but it was his community that declared a state of emergency as they dealt with the suicide crisis late last fall. Under his leadership and with his sincere concern for his people, he led his people through some of these very, very difficult situations, and many since. And this is a leader that, watching his leadership and his care for his people, is a source of inspiration for anybody who's been able to watch that journey. Very recently, I had the pleasure of meeting with the chief again. He brought along with him Elder Morningchild. They came to my office about a month ago. Madam Speaker, between the time of his declaration of an emergency a year ago and the beginning of the pandemic in March, Chief Mitswing advised me that there were about 40 young people on their suicide watch list. Since COVID-19 and the consequences that the pandemic has placed on his community, he is now dealing with over 100 young people on his watch list. Madam Speaker, this is in a community of about 1,000 people. Imagine being a leader like Chief Mitswing, having to hear politicians in Ottawa debate the wording of an oath, and then pack their bags, turn off Zoom, and go home for the evening, feeling satisfied that they accomplished something significant on behalf of Indigenous people. Imagine their frustration. Or imagine the frustration of the members of Neskantaga, who had to evacuate their community during a pandemic due to a 25-year-long boil water advisory. At the time, when federal health officials are asking people to limit their contact by staying home as much as possible, this community was loaded onto airplanes and sent to live in a hotel many miles from home. One only has to watch the video of the children of Neskantaga put out by their chief, Chris Munias, asking questions like, when is the water going to get fixed? Are we going to get help? When are we going home? Madam Speaker, it's heartbreaking, it's devastating, it's shameful. The community that welcomed the then Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs in 2016, who made these people a promise that the issue would be fixed by 2018. Now they find themselves sitting in a hotel far away from their community, having to witness the irony of this minister's government putting forward a bill that asks new Canadians to make a promise. This government can't even keep its own promises, Madam Speaker. It's more of a do as I say, not as I do. Imagine their frustration. Speaking of water, Madam Speaker, there's a small community in my riding that provides healthy, clean drinking water and other services to an adjoining or neighboring First Nations community. Due to an ongoing jurisdictional issue with respect to payment, this small community is owed money and has been carrying the debt of the federal government for years. I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, but a small municipality should never be put in a position where a decision has to be made on turning off water to their neighbors to finally bring attention to the fact that they are owed a very significant amount of money that, quite honestly, should be allocated to other services that their residents need at this difficult time. 7 months ago, I raised this issue directly with the Minister of Indigenous Services, his Chief of Staff, and the department's Western Desk representative. As of last week, Madam Speaker, the promised meeting between the department, the First Nation, and the community has yet to take place or to even be scheduled. Madam Speaker, at a time when neighbors need to work together, this government's inability to act in a reasonable amount of time is divisive and damaging to these communities. Imagine their frustration. Madam Speaker, the leaders of First Nations and Métis communities in my riding have done an outstanding job managing the first wave of COVID in the spring. They took the required actions necessary to keep their people safe. Their tireless work on the ground allowed for a potential health crisis to be averted in many of these communities. Now, as cases begin to rise again, so does the anxiety of what is ahead for them as leaders. Do they have enough PPE for their communities? How do they acquire the much-needed rapid testing? How are they going to manage checkpoints in winter conditions? Who is going to ensure the safety and health of the elderly and the vulnerable in their communities? When a vaccine is approved, how will they gain access and distribute it among their people? Madam Speaker, the leaders of these communities need this government focused on providing the essential supports that they badly need to keep their people safe. They are tired, they are anxious, and they deserve more than a symbolic gesture in this trying time. You'd have to spend a lot of time searching for a leader in these communities who would suggest to me that changing the wording of the oath of citizenship is a top priority this government should be focusing on right now. I think it is time, Madam Speaker, to move beyond words. It's time for actions, for concrete actions. Madam Speaker, this begins with taking responsibility for acting slow to close down borders in Canada, taking responsibility for sending mixed messages to Canadians regarding masks, taking responsibility for ignoring the need for rapid tests across Canada, taking responsibility for poorly created relief programs that shut out Indigenous businesses and many others, and generationally, Madam Speaker, taking responsibility for not living up to their promise to end drinking water advisories by this spring. Madam Speaker, the government must act. It must act to end drinking water advisories with the same intensity it did when creating and passing CERB, and dare I say, when covering up its corruption in the WE scandal. It must support First Nations dealing with high rates of youth suicide. It must act to address the issues outlined in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. And it must act to show real leadership rather than the crisis management in situations such as the Mi'kmaq lobster fishery or land claim disputes in Caledonia. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Skeena-Buckley Valley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to try to link together the former speaker's comments with my honourable colleague's comments just now. And one of the things that the member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou, mentioned was how moving citizenship ceremonies are. And my honourable colleague just mentioned the record of Stephen Harper. When I was the mayor of Smithers, I only got to attend one citizenship ceremony because the next year, Stephen Harper's government cut small-town citizenship ceremonies across the country. I'm wondering if my honourable colleague would join me in calling for the reinstatement of those citizenship ceremonies so that the change that we are debating today and will hopefully be passed into law can be made even more significant for people living in rural Canada.
The Honourable Member for Denete, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for the question. Madam Speaker, we hear lots of talk about going back to Harper and the Conservative days and what they did or didn't do. I think I would remind the member that it was Mr. Harper that issued the original apology for the harm done by the residential schools, and it was Mr. Harper that initiated the whole process that led to the recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I don't think we should undermine the work that was done under a Conservative government for many of the things that were done. And I think we need to continue to work towards that. In my comments, I'm not undermining the importance of the citizenship oath. What I'm saying is that we need to go to the place where we're actually fixing real problems for real people on the ground in these northern communities. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kenora.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his speech and his wonderful comments on this important piece of legislation. And the member from Northern Saskatchewan has a very similar riding to me in Northern Ontario and many similar issues, one of which he mentioned in his speech was the COVID-19 response in northern communities and in Indigenous communities. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, about where some of the gaps existed and what the government needs to do to ensure that northern communities are prepared for any subsequent wave of the pandemic. Thank you.
Mississippi, Churchill River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Kenora for his question and the work he's doing. He's very right. His riding is extremely similar to mine, and we face many similar issues. And I'm sure he would speak to the same things that I might as we dealt with some of the leaderships from the First Nation communities, from the Métis communities, from the Tribal Council leaderships, when it came to ensuring that there was appropriate personal protective equipment for these communities. As we advanced further through the pandemic and moved on to the testing, the need for testing and the awareness of how important that was, the need for rapid testing and how we get it into these remote and northern communities. There was so many things. We had the example in my riding in La Loche and the neighboring First Nation there, and we saw the provincial government and the leaders come together to institute an incredible testing regime that shut that crisis down in the Loche very quickly. So I would agree with the member that we need to be aware of all of these things in ridings that are similar, like his and mine, and make sure that we just keep advocating on behalf of those people.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I just wanted to point out the importance of the significance of the legislation as one of the calls for action. It is something that I believe goes a long way in demonstrating very clearly that as a government we want to continue to move forward on the issue of reconciliation. And if the member could just provide some thoughts with respect to that issue.
The Honourable Member for Denison, Mississippi, Churchill River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question. I would challenge my colleague to ensure that we understand that there is very important components to some of the symbolic gestures and making sure that we work with our Indigenous friends and their leadership. But I would challenge my colleague to look in the mirror and ask, have we done enough as government when it comes to boil water advisories? Have we done enough when it comes to the suicide crisis? Have we done enough when it comes to housing and some of the challenges that these communities face? Instead of patting ourselves on the back for getting some things done. Why don't we get on the ground and get working to get many things that are more important to these communities done?
Reprise du débat. Resuming debate. The honourable member for